The name Montesquieu was mentioned by Dan, and I'm going to touch on him in the course of this talk, because in some sense, he's been a guide for me in thinking about this particular question. Montesquieu was an 18th century French aristocrat from the area near Bordeaux. On his estate, which still exists, they made wine. And he wrote 3 important books in the course of the 18th century. One was called Persian Letters, which was an epistolary novel and a kind of philosophical work, satirical in question. It's how visiting Persians might look on France. And so it was the strangeness of France he was trying to bring home to the French people with this. He wrote a second book called Considerations on the Greatness, on the Causes of the Greatness and the Decline of Ancient Rome. And then he wrote a massive book published in 1748 called The Spirit of Laws. And it was a bestseller, translated into virtually every European language. It is cited in the literature of the American Revolutionary period more often than any other book, including John Locke. He was once someone that everyone knew about and everyone read. And when I went to an agent with a book on Montesquieu some years ago, he discovered that the book publishers in New York had never heard of Montesquieu. So it ended up being published by Yale University Press, where they had heard of Montesquieu. But he'll figure in this. What I want to talk about is our future and the role that tyranny will play in it. And the original title of this was The New Face of Tyranny. So I will talk a bit about the old face of tyranny, but I'll then turn to the new face of tyranny. When the First World War ended, there was a brief period when it seemed as if the world had really become safe for democracy. When it seemed as if history had come to an end, liberal democracy had achieved a lasting hegemony, and the League of Nations would guarantee peace. Something similar happened in 1945, when the Second World War came to an end, and the United Nations was established. The same thing happened again just over 70 years after the end of the First World War, when the Berlin Wall came down, when Eastern Europe liberated itself, when the Soviet Union fell apart and the Cold War came to an end. It seemed as if finally, the world would be safe for democracy. And my friend Frank Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, which has been an embarrassment ever since to the poor man. On none of these occasions were the heady hopes of the victors borne out. In all 3 cases, tyranny gradually re-emerged. After World War II, it wasn't gradual. And disappointment dogged those who had imagined that the dream articulated by Immanuel Kant in his essay on perpetual peace would be fulfilled. None of this should come as a surprise. Tyranny, in one form or another, has been the norm throughout human history, and it is not apt to disappear. As that man Montesquieu, whom I just described, observed 275 years ago in his Spirit of the Laws, the avoidance of tyranny requires artifice. To form a moderate government, he tells us, it is necessary to combine powers, to regulate them, to temper them, to make them act, to give, so to speak, a ballast to one in order to put it in a condition to resist another. This is a masterpiece of legislation which chance rarely produces and prudence is rarely allowed to produce. What he has in mind is something like bicameralism, the separation of powers, an independent judiciary, those institutions which he found when he visited England in the late 1720s. He goes on and he says, though it constitutes an assault on human nature, despotism is in a sense natural. It jumps up, so to speak, before our eyes. It is uniform throughout, as the passions alone are necessary for its establishment. The whole world is good enough for that. That last sentence I'm going to reread because I think it's something that we should reflect upon. Tyranny, despotism, jumps up, so to speak, before our eyes. It is uniform throughout. As the passions alone are necessary for its establishment, the whole world is good enough for that. Petty tyranny is everywhere to be seen in our own world, and it will never disappear. Consider the recent Me Too vogue. What did it reveal? It revealed that all sorts of men in important places were abusing their power to make use of women. It's especially pertinent in this city because Hollywood is the place where it most often happens. Let me put it in these terms. The sign that tyranny is our natural condition is we revert to it, at least at the petty level, on almost any occasion when power is concentrated, even in the private sphere, in the hands of a single human being. Or when someone controls a good that is rare, like a successful acting career, and can make use of it. Here's another way of putting it. Human beings can stand up to anything but temptation. And the concentration of power or even influence frequently, not always, frequently gives rise to some form of tyranny. Corporate executives, state governors, mayors. Think what we've all been through. And think how often it is the case that the governor of a state, the mayor of a city, imposes mandates on people and then does not observe the mandates himself or herself. The French Laundry is everywhere to be seen. And you can just go down the list. I'm sure somewhere there is a governor who imposed mandates and who observed them himself. But I don't know the name of any such person. And my bet is you don't either. Now, this is not terribly important, going to the French Laundry. But it is a sign of the human capacity to exempt oneself from the rules if one has enough power and enough influence. And that's what Montesquieu is pointing to. And so when he says that to form a moderate government, it is necessary to combine powers, to regulate them, to temper them, to make them act, to give, so to speak, a ballast to one in order to put it in a condition to resist another, what he has in mind is checks and balances of various sorts and our need for them. Now, if we're to understand our present predicament, we'll have to take into account just how fragile liberal democracies are and the preconditions for their survival. In this regard, Montesquieu insisted size matters. As he noticed, the first republics known to man relied on civic virtue, and to sustain themselves, they had to be small enough for shame to be a formidable force. In antiquity, he also pointed out, all of the polities situated on extended territories were despotisms. where fear was brought in as a substitute for shame, as a source of political and social discipline. In a large republic, Montesquieu observed, interests become particular. A man senses then that he can be happy, great, glorious without his fatherland, and soon that he can be great solely on the ruin of his fatherland. One consequence of such a republic's size is that the common good is sacrificed to 1,000 considerations. It is subordinated to the exceptions. It depends on accidents. The situation in a small republic is more favorable. There, the public good is more fully felt, better known, closer to each citizen. The abuses are less extensive there, and as a consequence, less well protected. By way of contrast, Montesquieu added, a large empire presupposes a despotic authority in the one who governs. One cannot deny that promptness in decision-making is required to compensate for the distance of the places to which orders are sent. That fear is required to prevent negligence on the part of the governor or magistrate operating at a great distance. That in such circumstances, law must be lodged in a single head, and that it must change unceasingly, for accidents really do multiply in a state in proportion to its magnitude. This, he did not have to say, was the experience of Rome. He'd written a book on Rome. That polity's expansion was fatal to its republican character. And if you pause and think about it, polities as large as Russia, polities as large as China, have really never known, except for maybe brief moments, anything but despotism. It was Montesquieu's analysis that occasioned the great debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the United States in 1787 and 1788. As everyone understood at the time, the fledgling polity was far too large to qualify as a small republic. Federalism was the remedy suggested by Montesquieu. A loose confederation of republics could command sufficient resources to provide for the common defense, while its member republics remained small enough to maintain free institutions. Unfortunately, however, most of the states composing the nascent American Union were themselves too large to be considered small republics. Remember, Virginia included West Virginia and Kentucky. New York, the empire state, really is an empire. And under the Constitution proposed by the federal Constitution, the national government had much greater scope than the confederations Montesquieu had in mind. It was a much tighter system. To meet the challenge posed by Montesquieu's analysis of the lessons to be learned from the history of republics, James Madison and his colleagues looked to the French philosophes' analysis of a third form of government, the species of law-bound monarchy, limited in scope, that emerged in medieval Europe, and to his discussion of the form of government that subsequently developed out of this in England as its monarchy evolved. These two species of government had upheld constitutionalism and the rule of law in polities situated on territories of intermediate size, and the latter of the two, equipped as it was with a House of Commons capable of imposing its will on the monarch, was quasi-republican in character. In framing the proposed Constitution, the delegates at the convention had combined two institutions that Montesquieu had praised: federalism and the separation of powers perfected by the English. And Madison even argued counterintuitively that the multiplication of special interests, about which we complain incessantly today, attendant on the size of the fledgling nation, could be put to good use. It would, he suspected, turn out to be an obstacle to the formation of a majority faction, and it would thereby encourage within the new republic's legislature a spirit of accommodation and compromise conducive to the pursuit of justice and the common good. Now, he came to this conclusion, this counterintuitive conclusion, that special interests could be an advantage on the basis of his experience in Virginia, where he got through the legislature of Virginia Thomas Jefferson's Statute of Religious Liberty. Now, in trying to get this through the legislature, he appealed to the better natures of people. He wrote a little tract on this. In the end, however, he realized that that is not why it passed. Every religious sect in Virginia, the Episcopalians, formerly the Anglicans, the Methodists, the Baptists, and so forth, the Presbyterians above all, would have liked to impose their religion on everybody. Talk about petty tyranny, and not so petty in some cases. But they all backed the Statute of Religious Freedom. Why? Because they were all afraid that they would be the ones imposed upon. None of them had much hope that they would be the majority. So, out of selfishness, they do the right thing. And it was the multiplication of special religious interests that was the underpinning of religious freedom in Virginia. And he thought, perhaps something similar will work when you're talking about material interests in the Congress of the United States. However, in the 1790s, quite soon after the American Republic was established, some of those quite deeply involved in the founding came to have misgivings. It was in response to the legislative program proposed by George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, that James Madison began thinking about the prospect his compatriots would eventually face: a consolidation of states into one government. In other words, a subversion of federalism. And the consequences that would follow from a concentration of such power in the federal government. First, he argued, the incompetency of one legislature to regulate all the various objects belonging to the local governments would evidently force a transfer of many of those objects to the executive department. First, a decline in federalism, then a decline in the legislative power. And what you would have is an executive issuing decrees or regulations. And that would substitute for what the legislative power did. So you'd have a concentration of power in the central government and then a further concentration of power in the executive. Then he contended that if the state and local governments were made subject to the federal government, the sheer size of the country would prevent that control on the federal Congress, which is essential to a faithful discharge of its trust, since neither the voice nor the sense of 10 or 20 millions of people spread through so many latitudes as are comprehended within the United States could ever be combined or called into effect if deprived of those local organs through which both can now be conveyed. Notice he's talking about 10 or 20 million people, not 330 million people. In such circumstances, Madison warned, the impossibility of acting together might be succeeded by the inefficacy of partial expressions of the public mind, and this at length by a universal silence and insensibility, leaving the whole government to that self-directed course, which it must be owned, is the natural propensity of every government. So what you would have are the forms of Republican government, but not the reality. And the reality is the government would direct the country rather than the country directing the government. And the government would consist of the executive. In short, Madison revisited Montesquieu's arguments concerning republics and the extent of territory suitable to them, and at a time when the territory was much smaller than it is now, and the population was not even 1/15 of what it is now, he began to worry that the extent of territory encompassed by the United States and the size of its population might be too great. He was, moreover, virtually certain that if the federal government were allowed to encroach on the prerogatives of the states and the localities, as he believed Hamilton intended, despotism of one sort or another would be the result. Now, Madison was no doubt wrong about Hamilton and Hamilton's program. And later in his life, he tacitly acknowledged as much by proposing, as president, the establishment of the Second National Bank. He had fought bitterly against the First National Bank. But his analysis of what might happen was nonetheless on point. It foreshadowed Alexis Tocqueville's warnings concerning the dangers of administrative centralization, and it pertains to virtually every republic on the globe. All of them are based on the English or the American model, and by now, in all of them, thanks to ambition and emergencies, the administrative state and the executive power loom large. If you look at what happened all over the world in the last couple of years, you can see the degree to which that has happened. Beneath the benign surface of every republic in the world, there lurks the edifice of a despotism more fully tyrannical than any government in earlier times. In the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler demonstrated just how easily one could transform a republic, this one equipped by Max Weber with all of the standard institutional safeguards, into a totalitarian state. Hitler did nothing illegal. He simply made use of what was there in the Constitution in ways that people had not foreseen. And he was able to do so because of an emergency. The tyrants of antiquity, Cleisthenes of Sicyon, Cypselus and Periander of Corinth, Pisistratus and Hippias of Athens, Polycrates of Samos, Hero of Syracuse, and the like, were not especially ambitious, and the same can be said for the despots of medieval and Renaissance Italy. They desired power and glory, to be sure, and not infrequently they were great builders. They delighted in projecting power abroad, and in Greece, as Aristotle points out, they were exceedingly wary of domestic opposition. Men of distinction and high thoughts, they sidelined or killed. Dining clubs and education they sought to eliminate. They did what they could to isolate citizens from one another and to sow distrust. And they employed spies, even to the point of encouraging women to inform on their husbands and slaves to report on the conversations of their masters. But they did not aspire to be lawgivers, and they interfered minimally with the lives of those who posed no threat to their rule. True ambition was left to Lycurgus, to Solon and the like, which is to say, to the founders of republics. One could argue that Augustus in Rome was an exception to the rule. He surreptitiously founded a new regime and did so by a process of trial and error with considerable care and forethought, and it survived more or less intact for centuries. Oliver Cromwell later tried something of the sort, but with less success. But these two had no real successors, unless in the case of Cromwell you think of the Ayatollah Khomeini. It was Napoleon Bonaparte who set the stage for the new species of tyranny that emerged in the wake of the First World War. Bonaparte's ambitions were those of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and one need only peruse the code the Napoleonic Code, to see just how self-consciously transformative his rule was. The great tyrants of the 20th century, Mussolini, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, and Mao, and their imitators in countries of less heft, Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, and Fidel Castro, all claimed, as had Napoleon, that they were bringing wisdom and science to bear on human affairs. For inspiration, the men responsible for pioneering the reconfiguration of tyranny, the making of tyranny as ambitious as the founding of the ancient republics, they looked to Machiavelli's Prince, which celebrated as the pinnacle of princely virtue quasi-legendary figures such as Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. These men, the Florentine, singled out because each was said to have overthrown the existing order and to have introduced what the Florentine called new orders and modes. And he intimated that their institution of new orders and modes was akin in each case to the establishment of a new religion. They were, he said, armed prophets. And he made it clear that their task was not just to govern, but to make men believe. It was the vision of new orders and modes laid out by Machiavelli and the Prince that inspired Sir Francis Bacon to articulate in his Advancement of Learning something like a secular religion promising the creation of heaven on earth through science. And as Bacon makes clear in his New Atlantis, it was this utopian aspiration that first gave tyranny a new face and justified its intervention in private life on a scale prefigured nowhere other than in the ancient Lacedaemonian Republic, where, however, the Spartan lawgiver, operating on a tiny community, never numbering more than 10,000 adult males, could rely on shame, tyrannies, situated as they were on extended territories, had to resort to terror and extend the ethos of fear and mutual distrust, hitherto restricted in tyrannies to the sphere occupied by men of distinction, to the world inhabited by ordinary women and men. These tyrants were not without resources. They possessed, via the apparatus of the modern state, an administrative capacity unknown anywhere in antiquity. The ancient Lacedaemonians were policed by the oversight of their fellow citizens. Their modern Italian, Russian, German, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cambodian counterparts were kept in order by state agents in what came to be called a police state. Nothing has happened in the past 30 years to impair the administrative capacity of the modern state. Instead, that capacity is advanced by leaps and bounds as a consequence of the digital revolution. The totalitarian states of yesteryear were totalitarian in aspiration, but not fully in fact. A great deal escaped their purview. And as the existence of samizdat in the old Soviet Union suggests, dissent stubbornly persisted in the interstices of these societies. For surveillance, they depended on a great army of human beings who were often careless, lazy, and negligent. And demands they made on their bureaucracies often exceeded the capacity of those bureaucracies. Now, however, thanks to CCTV cameras and facial recognition software, to cell phones and the devices that track them, and to the internet and the data collection carried out by those who supply its users with search engines and other applications, all now seconded by artificial intelligence and the astonishing powers of contemporary computers. As a consequence of all of this, privacy is a thing of the past. And it is in principle possible to track hundreds of millions of individuals through every hour of the day, noting where they go, what they do, with whom they communicate, and even what they write and say. Someday soon, electronic sensors may even be capable of reading the minds of women and men who happen to be nearby. As everyone is aware, the Chinese government is now engaged in a great experiment, testing the new technology of population control. There is no need to rehearse here the horrors being perpetrated on the Uyghurs of Xinjiang province. What matters most is that the experiment seems to be succeeding, that the Chinese intend to employ the same techniques of surveillance and persuasion in the whole country, that other despotisms, such as the Iranian regime, are already using CCTV cameras and facial recognition software to hunt down dissidents, and that in time, the full panoply of surveillance technology is apt to be adopted here and elsewhere. Had the old Soviet Union possessed such a capacity, the regime would probably still be with us. Even more important, the same technology is available to the United States, in Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand, and in Europe. It's being used. Our computers, cell phones, and search engines track our whereabouts, our interests, our tastes, and our opinions. And they report to others who promise to preserve our privacy and who make enormous profits from breaching that promise. Moreover, all the information that these private entities collect is in principle available to those who govern it. All it takes is a court order, and they don't even bother with that, as some recent cases show. And a court order is easily secured. Those in power who wish to remain in power have in the past abused the surveillance authority accorded the state, and they will certainly do so again. All that it takes to justify such requests is a widespread conviction that there is a national emergency, or one of those waves of hysteria that liberal democracies engender from time to time. And though the focus has changed, we still remain vulnerable to utopian aspirations. If there is one thing that human beings cannot resist, it is the temptation to busy themselves with the lives of others. Thank you. No questions?
Comment, not a question. Your reference to Hitler taking over essentially from the Weimar Republic. There is no history of any kind of democratic institutions in Germany. The United States had a long history of democratic institutions under the 13 colonies. They had legislatures, they had governors, they had elections, even though they weren't like elections that we have today. But so there is a history of democratic institutions in the United States, in England. There was never a democratic institution in Cuba or Venezuela, Vietnam,
China, Russia,
Okay,
yeah.
So this place is kind of unique, place we call the United States of America.
Right. Look, the English-speaking world, to use a Churchillian phrase, has considerable advantages because what we inherited from the British, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the Australians, they also inherited.
We can throw the bombs out.
We can for the time being, but what I'm talking about, though, is informational power that allows emergencies to be turned, and there are emergencies, they just happen. And the size of the country means they happen with a certain frequency. It's just a given. The opportunities for abuse are enormous. And You know, in the period from 1945 on, the so-called Cold War state, there were abuses. They weren't widespread, they weren't pervasive, but they were there. I fear there will be more, and that our institutions are fragile. And we now have built in the equivalent of dictatorial powers, which, by the way, that's how the Weimar Republic fell, decree power. You can see it in my state, Michigan, where the governor has the power to declare an emergency at her or his discretion. It's her right now. And to issue decrees that have the force of law. There is no separation of powers once that's been done. By the way, there was a discussion in Virginia of including a provision for dictatorship in emergencies in the Virginia Constitution. And his notes on the state of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson went after that, saying, no, 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 we do not want that road being open at all. The Roman practice had been the dictator could only serve for 6 months, and that at the end of the 6 months, he essentially went on trial. And so there was a kind of check, but it wasn't enough to stop the thing from being abused. And so Jefferson was against it. In virtually every state in the Union, in the sort of long progressive period that begins in the 1880s and stretches into the 1950s, some sort of legislation was put in place that allows governors extraordinary power and unchecked power in emergencies. But who declares the emergency? That's the same guy.
But can't the courts overrule it at some?
They haven't done it. Let's put it this way. There's been a lot of this in the last couple of years, and the courts have a way of only acting after the emergency is over. That's beginning to happen in a couple places. There was someone way in the back who had a hand up. I think it was a student.
Oh, yeah. I understand that it's a huge risk technology poses to being taken over tyrannically or used like authoritatively. But would you also say that it's also opened up a huge access to be able for people to dissent and go against regimes? And do you think there's any hope with technology?
Well, what you say is interesting, and to some degree it's true, what you're saying. I mean, for example, when there was resistance to the government in Egypt a few years back during the Arab Spring, a lot of the coordination took place through technology. And it also opened up the possibility for ordinary people to speak. They didn't have to go through newspapers owned by whoever. There were blogs and blog posts and so forth, and that still exists. But we have quasi-monopolies now controlling a lot of aspects of the internet. And to be heard, you've got to get past these monopolies. And they're censoring now. You know, the sort of ethos of the internet early on was anything goes. We're opening up freedom. That's not what's been going on in the last years. And it doesn't surprise me. Once you get a monopoly, the temptation to use the power is very, very great. Look, the kind of petty tyranny that I was talking about earlier, another way that you can see it is we no longer have newspapers, but back when we did have newspapers, if you got a one newspaper town, that newspaper controlled information to a very great degree. And the owners of that newspaper had tremendous power. I grew up in Oklahoma City, and all the newspapers were owned by one guy. And he used to meet with the city council in private to tell them what to do. And it wasn't until the foundation of another newspaper by the first Democrat ever to be defeated for governor of Oklahoma, to get the nomination ever to be defeated, called the Oklahoma Journal. And I, by the way, I was a newspaper reporter for the Oklahoma Journal, so I know all about this. What they did in the first week that they were publishing is they put front page pictures of him meeting with the city council secretly. But nobody would touch it. So we have that problem developing. And it would be a good thing if those monopolies were broken up. Monopolies are always a temptation, not just to take material advantage, meaning to jack up prices, but also to control, because unfortunately, we instinctively love to control other people. It's a nasty side of us. And you know, most people are pretty controlled, are pretty self-controlled in that regard, but can they face temptation? You know, it's easy to be good if you don't face temptation. Just put a very fine piece of chocolate on the table in front of you and look at it for a while. You should take it, but what will you do? Another question. Yeah, another student.
What role do you think that increased political polarization and mass media plays in your theory?
I have to ask you, can you lower, and I hope this isn't endangering anybody, but it's hard to, yeah, please.
What role does increased political polarization and mainstream media play in your theory?
Well, the polarization's real, and the changing character of mainstream media is also real. They used to pretend to be impartial. The pretense is pretty much gone now. It has to do with utopian aspirations that have a strong grip on the well-to-do people in this country, the sort of people who went to the top schools and make the most money. You know, I'm a 60s person. That is to say, I was born in 1948. I went to college in the 1960s. I witnessed building takeovers and so forth. And the aspirations of the new left of my day have become the aspirations of a large class of people. And there's a lot of resistance to that. And this large class controls the newspapers and so forth. Now, part of the story about media is there isn't much of it left. One of the things the internet did is it killed the newspaper. And it was done by Craigslist. I once was a discussion leader at a conference on the history of the newspaper, and the reading was an eye-opener for me. The newspaper is entertainment to get you to buy the thing so that it can get advertisers. And the advertisers that most matter are the people who buy little tiny things to sell their used car. And you know, a page of type with umpteen people wanting to sell this little thing or buy this little thing adds up to a great deal of money. And Craigslist took that away from every newspaper in the country. And most of them have closed down. In other words, what is it that keeps newspapers straight? Competition with other newspapers. That's why I said something about a one newspaper town, because I grew up in one. The other newspapers will cover what you don't cover. And that competition will keep them relatively straight. But if you eliminate the competition, if you get to the stage there's only one newspaper or none, and in an awful lot of places, there's no newspapers left because there's not a business model for news. So what's happened with the mainstream media? Well, newspapers like the New York Times have gone very partisan. And they're making their money insofar as they're making money. And by the way, they haven't paid a dividend in many years. By making it the kind of party newspaper. If you're on board, you take this newspaper. And you know, Fox News is sort of that way, and CNN is sort of that way. So they're going for niche audiences in order to find some sort of business model so they can keep in operation. But in the process, they've abandoned covering the news, except insofar as it suits their constituency. And that's one of the causes of the polarization. Yeah.
Colonel McCormick owned the Chicago Tribune, where I grew up, and he had a particular point of view, and the paper reflected it.
Yeah.
Now, there were competitive newspapers, the Chicago Times, and then the Sun, and then they merged, and the Daily News, which eventually merged with the Sun Times. But they did have some, let's say, competition of ideas. My father read the Tribune, read religiously. My mother read the Sun Times.
Mm-hmm.
I read them both, sort of.
Yeah.
Kid growing up.
Yeah.
But there were points of view, there were specific points of view, and who you voted for, at least federally, nationally, versus locally, was significant opinion in the Tribune and some of the
Yeah.
newspapers.
Yeah. It's that diversity that's crucial. Think of what McCormick would have been like if he hadn't had the competition. And if you don't cover the news, and somebody else does cover the news, people are going to be dropping your newspaper. Look, there was a newspaper when I was younger in New Hampshire. It was called the Union Leader. And it had a very opinionated owner. And it was nicknamed the Onion Loader because of his opinions. But it wasn't a bad newspaper on the news side. It was the editorials, which he sometimes put on the front page, that drove things. Yes?
So, my background is business. I'm not an academic. My impression of American history is that there are multiple events that you can look at where communications technology has changed. It's given rise to fundamental reshaping of information flows, whether it's from a newspaper, when you go back to the founding fathers, the newspaper business in those days would hardly meet your standard
Right.
of fairness.
Highly partisan.
Television, radio, this has happened over and over again. It's a business. Newspapers are no different than any other media business. They pursue a market and make a buck. So thinking that, or expecting that there's a solution to the issues that we're talking about here today by going back to the 1960s model of newspaper publishing,
Right.
that's a real stretch.
No.
My question, though, would be,
You
commented in your observations about Madison, some of his thoughts about the common good, or with that terminology was used to describe the process of forming the country, writing the Constitution, and so on. From where I sit, it doesn't feel like there is, and this goes to your questions, I think, or your concerns about scale and in the viability of republics. But there's also this concept of common good. And I don't know that we have in this country a sense of what holds us together. What is it a common? And I'm curious to know, in history or in your thinking about where we are today, is there a different model that's an alternative to tyranny and CLAFI?
Right. Well, look, there's never been a really robust understanding of the common good of the sort you would find in ancient Sparta, ancient Athens, or ancient Rome. And the reason is partly there was tremendous economic diversity. Look, if you're talking about ancient Athens, ancient Sparta, ancient Rome, they're almost all farmers.
Right.
And the common good is to take land from some other city. Well, he sort of did, but he knew better than that. The founding fathers had an understanding there would be all sorts of industry. There would be tremendous variety in agricultural production. You know, they weren't all growing wheat or grains. And that what you would have in a sense of common good was the rule of law, the sanctity of property, the preservation of life, and national defense. So there was a limited set of things to be done. And what's excluded from the common good? Well, holiness. In other words, every previous republic had been held together by a religion. And here there was a decision to disagree on religion. Very important for American history, and really very successful. I mean, I don't mean there have not been incidents of religious persecution in the history of the country since 1787, but they're trivial if you look at it in comparison with what the rest of history looks like. So where did the common good come in that regard? Religious freedom. So to some degree, the common good has been about leaving people alone, except in certain limited ways. Enforcement of contracts. Think what it would be like to be a businessman if there were no enforcement of contracts. You'd have to hire someone to enforce it for you. And we know how that works. So it's a kind of limited expectations from government and really limited expectations from the nation as a whole. Now, there's a problem with that. We long for more. We long for warmth, community. You know, think of the New Left of the 1960s. You know, direct democracy, participatory democracy. There was criticism at that time of the secret ballot because there ought to be unity, unanimity. So there've always been movements in this country of a more totalizing sort. That want the community to be more complete. And sometimes what they've done is they've created a little utopian community. The Mormon migration to Utah was something like that, to pick a big one. But there were all these utopian communities in upstate New York in the 1830s.
Wouldn't you say the existence of those kinds of communities it denies the concept of common good? It's a very local, specific notion of good.
Right, but sometimes it emerges at the national level. I think right now, actually, there's something like that going on. Yes?
Has political party unity been as persuasive in the past as it seems to be now? And what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, look, political parties were not imagined by the people at the Constitutional Convention. The word party doesn't exist in the Constitution. and they were all hostile to political parties. And they expected petty interests and alliances and, negotiation, all that, yes. But standing, organized political parties. And the first presidents, by and large, thought of themselves as above party. And almost everything in American life, even when you got political parties, tugged at them not to be too serious. Because your interest was your constituency back home. Your interest was the state you were a senator for. And you represented the state, you didn't represent the party. That has changed a bit in the last, I'd say 30 years. It's been on its way since LBJ. He didn't like it. He liked the old way of operating. But the head of the Democratic National Committee under LBJ wanted the Democratic Party to become an ideological party. How do you do that? The answer is if you can control the money that people need to run for office at the center, you can make them march in line. And they've succeeded with that. There are very few dissenters. And the Republicans, to be viable, are going to have to imitate the Democrats. And they're doing that. They're moving in that direction. So it has to do with that, I think. It also has to do with sort of nationalization of politics. Look, in the beginning, you went to Congress to be a big guy back home. And you did a couple terms in Congress, and then you went back home and you were always called congressman for the rest of your life. And you were a local notable. You were somebody. Now people go to Washington and they never come home. And when they retire, they stay in Washington. There's been a real transformation. The emergence of the professional politician, at least at the congressional level, is the 1880s. And it's been sort of that way ever since. But the ties to the locality really are less and less. And it used to be you raised your money in state to run. And if you couldn't get it in state, you couldn't run. Now you can get it from somewhere else. And there are big money men who play a real role in American politics, billionaires, because they can throw it around and other people can't. One more, and then I know you want to shut it down. Yes, sir.
So emergencies are the pretext for imposing tyranny. And of course, there are real emergencies, indisputable emergencies. But do you think that Americans in particular and Westerners in general have in recent years become, well, either more susceptible to believing there's an emergency or even more alarming? Some people get a thrill out of the believing that there's an emergency. And so we're now in a situation in which emergencies are going to, come quick and they're going to always be.
It's a very good question, and I think there's something to what you're saying. Look, on the eve of World War I, there were a lot of people in places like Germany and France and England who were eager for war because they were bored out of their minds. And they thought, this will be exciting. And it was, but perhaps not in the ways that they expected. So, one of the problems with commercial bourgeois society is it doesn't give us a sense of direction. It doesn't give us much of a sense of purpose. And the longing for that, and emergencies provide, and wars are the old emergencies, they were very common, they give you a sense of adventure. And you get a taste for it. Yes, sir.
I don't want to close it down as long as there are, people ask questions, within reason. But although I found your talk very enjoyable, I did think it lacked a happy ending.
Yes.
And so, although I suppose this is a question for another lecture, or even more likely a whole course of lectures, maybe you can just give an inkling of whether you think that there are strategies, either through government, through laws or something of that sort, or societal, that might allow us to avoid tyranny, given, I mean, as I understand what you're saying, this infrastructure for tyranny is just more and more available and stronger and more powerful, and the occasions for sort of triggering that infrastructure are always available, and human nature is such that the motive will always be there. Do you think that you would have another lecture on what we might try to do about this to avoid it?
Yeah, I'm better, to be honest, at diagnosing the evil than at finding a cure. I will say this. I think monopolies, especially information monopolies, need to be broken up. Not for the old reason of jacking up prices, but because they become the means of manipulation. And of course, Colonel McCormick was manipulating a long time ago. This is not new.
Saying so.
Yeah, but give Colonel McCormick a monopoly, and it becomes much more dangerous. I don't expect perfection. We're not going to get it. But the creation of that other newspaper in Oklahoma City opened up Oklahoma politics in a remarkable way. And the guy who owned the Daily Oklahoman, that had been the state newspaper from the beginning of the state. He was a Sooner. So that's one thing. It might be good if it were easier to raise money for campaigns. You don't have to go through all this rigmarole.
All the things you've said, that's about the only thing I disagree with you. I think you're putting much too much importance on that, especially the party's involvement in it. But that's another subject. So.
Yeah, he knows a lot about this. So I'm apt to be wrong. The other thing is, it would help this country a great deal if someone would start a newspaper. Or if one of the existing newspapers were to decide to be a real newspaper and to draw a line between reporting the news and opinion. That line is never perfectly established, but and I think if a newspaper were to do that, it would become very popular.
I do think the Wall Street Journal is reasonably close to that.
Well, it could be, I think. I don't think it's all that close. I'll give you an example of something the Wall Street Journal did. If you remember, there was an incident in Minneapolis in which a black man died, and there were a group of policemen who were trying to get him under control. Yeah, that's right. From day one, the Wall Street Journal declared that that was murder. In the past, newspapers would not do that. They would not issue the verdict, and they did it right through. The conduct of the Wall Street Journal in that year was disgraceful in the extreme. And by the way, I no longer subscribe because of that. But that's the newspaper, if it got the right managing editor, that could move in the direction of trying to cover everything. I'll give you another example, the Hunter Biden laptop business. covered in October 2020 by one major newspaper, kind of semi-major, the New York Post. Avoided by all other newspapers, all the TV networks, including Fox. The New York Times just had a scoop 16 months later. The Hunter Biden laptop, it's real. I mean, the Wall Street Journal didn't cover it. So they've got a long ways to go. But they do have an institution. It's in place. It's a national newspaper. And I believe their subscriptions would go up dramatically. I mean, it'd take time.
One thing they have, which is like
And it would have an impact, by the way, on the other newspapers. Because if you make money at it, the businessman is gone. If you could make money at it, it's a model.
one thing that they have that's somewhat like the way the newspapers were when you and I were young is that the editorial section is conservative, and the news sections are, I think, despite the good examples you give, I think still is moderately progressive, not remorselessly and that's the way it was when you and I were young.
Sure.
The working press was sort of liberal, but they really weren't very ideological. And,
Right. Well, and
editorial sections were conservative.
the other thing is it was a working man's job. It was not an Ivy League graduate's job. It was a job for working stiffs, very bright people with a high school education who could write. Back when high schools taught people how to write, but that's a whole other subject. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Perhaps this is emblematic of your entire point, but you mentioned civic virtue at the beginning. I think, as a young person, perhaps, we have had a loss of civic virtue in this country. For quite some time. I spent a lot of time in classrooms, obviously. And I think that there's not engagement anymore. There's not an appreciation for, I think, our government systems. At the very least, our local systems. City council meetings are not very much attended, even though local policy has the biggest impact on our lives, right? More so than the federal government at times. But I think a lack of civic virtues is at the heart of maybe all this. What would you say to that?
You're partially right. I asked my students, including my graduate students in politics, because I'm a historian, but I teach in the graduate program in politics. Who's your city councilman? Who's your state representative? Who's your state senator? Who's your congressman? Can you name 6 United States senators? Not Mitch McConnell, not Schumer, not Elizabeth Warren, with whom I went to high school. We were on the debate team together. I pick a couple others that are names. And they can't do it. They can't do it because they can't do it because these people don't matter. In a way, it's only the president that matters. We've gotten to that stage. People will know who the governor is fairly often because the governor's got that same kind of centrality. There was another question. Yes.
It's been a very intriguing discussion this evening, really about tyranny. And on one hand, you describe tyranny as a norm. There's lives are built to be tyrannies. And when most of us think about tyranny, we think of totalitarian dictatorship, or we think of absolute monarchy. And yet, with this discussion, tyranny is much broader, much wider. And it seems like we're proposing antidotes to that tyranny, whether it's civic virtue, whether it's perhaps a free press with a diversity of views. But it seems like also as well that part of that antidote was law, at least as if I'm understanding right.
Yeah.
Part of what Montesquieu was suggesting suggesting that law in itself, and this in its own mind seems to lead to a paradox, because you could have seemingly a tyrannical democracy. Again, if there was simply just the rule of the majority that might ultimately prey upon the minority.
Well, look, that happens, it's funny, Professor Lowenstein mentioned that I was writing the latest book on Sparta, which, by the way, there are 4 in print. This will be the 5th and maybe the 6th. Yeah, but there's a certain madness to me. And I've been working on a battle called the Battle of Arginusae. And the Athenians won the battle with a ragtag fleet in which they had even cavalrymen rowing, unpracticed, unskilled, against a better fleet. And they won it because of generalship. I mean, it was really quite wondrous. That's why I want to go to this place, because I want to see it in detail. When these generals come back, they failed to do one thing. A storm came up immediately after the battle, and it became impossible to pick up the bodies of the survivors floating in the sea, and the dead bodies so they could be buried. And the Athenians broke all of their laws, and in the assembly voted to execute them without giving them a hearing. That describes exactly tyrannical majority. Okay, our institutions were forged in response to, as a correction to, the Athenian democracy. Can you have a democracy and the rule of law? That's what they were aiming at. For that to work, you've got to have honest judges. In other words, there's a kind of civic virtue required. And law schools used to take some care to instill that kind of civic virtue. You might not like the law, but if you're a prosecutor, you've got to enforce it. And you might advocate it being changed. That's perfectly legitimate. And if you're a judge, you've got to enforce it and not make up law. Well, in a world with utopian aspirations, there's a tendency to run roughshod over all of those forms and formalities that make possible the rule of law, the security of individuals, the security of their property, and their freedom to think in religious and non-religious matters, and speak in religious and non-religious matters, on religious and non-religious matters, as they see fit. And all of that's threatened now. So, your question brings me back to his question, which civic virtue is very important. Now, it could be that sobriety will set in, has a way of doing so. I follow Europe. I've lived there off and on, various moments. And I was at the American Academy in Berlin at one point. An American, someone from the State Department came through to give a talk on the Iranians and the nuclear weapon business. I happened to be sitting at dinner with the head of the Christian Democratic Party's section on foreign policy. He was the respondent to the talk. And I caught him afterwards and I said, can you imagine any time when the government of Germany would sanction using force to prevent the Iranians from getting nuclear weapons? He said, never. I'll bet that's changed. What's happened in Ukraine has transformed Europe. There was a period after the Cold War in which the Europeans, they thought they were better than all other human beings. They'd found the way. Everything could be negotiated. Everything could be talked through. And what they forgot was the security umbrella that made it possible for them to do that, which we provided. Well, events in Ukraine have sobered them up. And things may happen here that sober us up. I don't know. And if they do, you might get a return to that sense of civic virtue. Hard to be certain about that.